This week we'll be covering Chapter 12, Experiments with More Than One Independent Variable. This chapter is going to build off of what was covered last week. Specifically, we'll talk about how we can go from using one independent or manipulated variable to using more than one independent variable. By looking at more than one of these variables in the same study, we are able to uncover some additional information about how these variables interact with one another. We'll first start off by briefly reviewing some of the types of studies we went over last week, specifically those that simply use one independent variable. We'll then talk about experiments that use two independent variables at the same time, and how by employing this method we are able to see how these two variables interact with each other. We'll also discuss factorial variations of these types of studies, as well as discuss how we can go about identifying such factorial designs in your own readings and experiences. Let's first review single independent variable studies. These are studies that simply manipulate one thing and see how that manipulation changes the outcome or dependent variable. Let's take a look at two studies that use this single independent variable design. The first is a study that tried to answer whether people are angry when they drink. Take a look at the two graphs for a study by Aaron Duke and colleagues, examining the effects of alcohol on aggression. The placebo group drank orange juice with a very small amount of vodka in it, and the alcohol group drank enough vodka to reach a 0.10 blood alcohol concentration. Then participants played a computer game with an opponent who was in another room. Actually, they were playing against a computer. When the player made a mistake, the participant was to deliver a shock as punishment. Both the intensity and the duration of the shocks that were administered were measured. The graph on the left shows that the drunk group administered more intense shocks than the placebo group, and the graph on the right indicates that the drunk group administered shocks of longer duration than the placebo group. The second study involves cell phone use while driving. Strayer and Drews instructed participants to talk on a hands-free cell phone while playing on a realistic driving simulator. For two segments, they carried on a conversation on the phone, and for the other two segments, they were not on the phone. The order was counterbalanced for participants, and the dependent variable was brake onset time, or how long it took someone to start braking, measured in milliseconds. As you can see in the graph, drivers using the hands-free cell phone were slower to hit the brakes than those who were not talking on the phone and were instead having a conversation with someone in the same location as themselves. You should be able to see how these two studies simply manipulated one thing, either the amount of alcohol or the use of a cell phone while driving, and observed how this one variable changed the outcome variable, or the intensity and length of electric shock, or the time it took someone to start braking. We're now going to talk about how studies can manipulate more than one thing, or use multiple independent variables at the same time, and observe how they each affect the dependent variable. One of the most important reasons why a researcher might want to design a study that uses more than one independent variable is to observe how each of those variables interact with one another, or to observe an interaction effect. An interaction effect, also known as an interaction, occurs when the effect of one independent variable depends on the level of another independent variable. An interaction between two independent variables allows researchers to determine whether it depends. Let's reconsider the cell phone and driving study. This time, a second independent variable, age, is added to determine whether the effects of cell phone depends on age. A mathematical way to describe an interaction between two independent variables is a difference in differences. In other words, it's the effect of one independent variable, such as cell phone condition versus no cell phone condition, on the level of another independent variable, for example, reaction times of older drivers versus younger drivers. Let's now talk more about these interactions and look at some examples of experiments that investigate how two independent variables interact with each other. Here we see some graphs that display results from studies with two independent variables and one dependent variable. The first study, or the graph on the left, looks at the two independent variables of type of food, either ice cream or pancakes, and the temperature of that food, either hot or cold, and the dependent variable of how much you like that food. You can see here that the graph actually has two lines, and this is different from previous graphs we've looked at that only have one line on them. We use one axis on the graph, here the bottom or x-axis, to represent one of the independent variables, and the color of line to represent the other independent variable. We can see here just by looking at the shape of the graph that there is an interaction effect present. We know this because the two lines are intersecting or crossing over one another. If we think about what this is describing, we can see that the dependent variable changes based on both of the two independent variables, but that it depends on the pattern of their two levels. So, you like ice cream when it's cold, but like pancakes when they're hot. So you can't say that you always like hot or cold food, but that it depends on both variables together. On the right-hand side of the screen, we see another example of an interaction effect. Here, we're looking at the two independent variables of either saying sit or not saying anything, and having a treat or not having a treat, and their effect on the dependent variable of the chance a dog will actually sit. We can once again see that the lines of the graph are intersecting, but what we can notice from the two graphs is that we can switch which independent variable is used for the axis or lines. It doesn't matter. Both ways we still see the same outcome, that the dependent variable changes depending on both levels of both independent variables, but that we can see an effect only when certain conditions are met. Another name for studies that use more than one independent variable are called factorial designs. Again, a factorial design is an experiment in which there are two or more independent variables. The independent variables are also called factors. Consider the Strayer and Drew's study that examined whether the effect of driving while talking on a cell phone depended on the driver's age. There are two independent variables, cell phone use and driver age. If you look at the figure here, you can see how factorial designs cross two independent variables. By crossing cell phone use and driver age, we end up with 4 cells, or unique conditions. That's 2 levels of independent variable 1 by 2 levels of independent variable 2, which equals 4 cells or conditions. You might have noticed that Strayer and Drews manipulated cell phone use, but they did not manipulate age. They only measured age. They couldn't manipulate age because they can't assign people to be young or old. Thus, age is a participant variable. However, it is treated as an independent variable in a factorial design. Sometimes, researchers conduct factorial designs to test whether an independent variable affects different kinds of people or people in different situations in the same way. They test the limit to which an effect exists on another variable. This figure shows the results from Strayer and Drew's cell phone and age study in a table form and in a graph form. You will notice that in the line graph, the two lines are parallel, which indicates that the effect of talking on a cell phone did not depend on age. In other words, there was no interaction between cell phone use and age. You can see that the older drivers overall were slower at braking than younger drivers, and participants overall were slower at braking while on a cell phone than when not, but that both young and older drivers took longer to brake when they were talking on a cell phone than when they were not. Testing the limit to which an effect extends relates to external validity. Remember the alcohol and aggression study? What if researchers wondered if the effects of alcohol on aggression depends on body weight? DeWall and colleagues randomly assigned men to a drunk group and a placebo group, and then measured their aggression through shock intensity during the shock game. As you can see by looking at the two graphs, which are the same except that the independent variables are switched around, the effect of alcohol was very strong for heavier men. Using a factorial design to test limits is called testing for moderators. A moderator is an independent variable that changes the relationship between another independent and dependent variable. A moderator results in an interaction. The effect of one independent variable depends on, or is moderated by, the level of another independent variable. For example, body weight moderates the effect of alcohol on aggression. Factorial designs can also be used to test theories. Many theories make predictions about how variables might interact with one another. Factorial designs are a good way to test an interaction to see if the results are consistent with your theory. Let's look at 2 examples of theories that can be tested using a factorial design: a theory of alcohol cues and a memory theory. So let's first look at the question, why does alcohol cause aggression? There are various theories about this. One theory is that alcohol can become cognitively associated with thoughts of aggression. Bartholow and Hines tested this theory by having participants view images and words on a computer monitor. They were told to indicate whether a string of letters was a word or not a word. Some of the words were aggression-related and others were neutral. Before seeing each string of letters, participants were briefly primed with a photo on the computer screen. Sometimes the photo related to alcohol, and other times it was a photo of a plant. It was hypothesized that participants would respond more quickly to identify aggression-related words after seeing a photo related to alcohol. This figure shows how the theory was tested by crossing two independent variables, photo type with 2 levels by word type with 2 levels, to equal 4 total cells. The results from the study are depicted here in a data table and a line graph. There was indeed an interaction between the two independent variables, and it was as expected based on the theory. When participants had just seen a photo of alcohol, they identified aggressive words more quickly. When participants had been primed with a photo of a plant, they were slower to identify aggressive words. This interaction supported the theory that people cognitively associate alcohol cues with aggressive concepts. Let's now look at our other example on memory. In this study, the researchers used a factorial design to test their theory about why memory develops with age. The results showed that the interaction of the two independent variables in the study, here participant age and type of item, was once again predicted by the theory that children's memory capacity can be better than adults when they know a lot about the topic. This study had a 2x2 design, with a participant variable being child experts or adult novices, and an independent variable, digits versus chess pieces. The number of items recalled was the dependent variable. The results, shown in figure 12.12, clearly demonstrate that while the adults had better memory than children for digits, the children had a better memory than adults for the domain in which they had more knowledge, chess pieces. When analyzing or looking at the results of a factorial study that has two independent variables, there are actually 3 results we need to interpret. 2 main effects, one for each independent variable, and 1 interaction effect, or the interaction between the 2 variables. Let's discuss each of these. The main effect is the overall effect of one independent variable on the dependent variable, averaging over levels of the other independent variable, and it identifies a simple difference. If you have 2 independent variables, then you will look for 2 main effects. In the top figure is data from a word association study. One independent variable, type of word, is highlighted in blue. The other independent variable, type of photo, is in yellow. To look for a main effect of word type, you would compute the reaction time to aggressive words and reaction time to neutral words by averaging across the 2 photo conditions. The marginal means for aggressive and neutral words are in the far right-hand column of the table. Notice that there is not much difference in the reaction times to aggressive words, 555 milliseconds, and to neutral words, 557 milliseconds, in the marginal means on the right. It appears that there is not a main effect for word type. To determine if there's a main effect for photo type, you would compute reaction time after seeing the alcohol photos averaged over word type, and reaction time after seeing plant photos averaged over word type. These averages are presented at the bottom in yellow. Again, there is not much difference between the 2 means, 556.5 for the alcohol photos and 555.5 for the plant photo. So, there is no main effect of photo type either. Main effects may or may not be statistically significant. Although researchers use marginal means to look for main effects, they use statistics to find out if the differences are statistically significant. The bottom table is from a study on aggression in drunk and sober men. The marginal means revealed a statistically significant main effect for drinking condition, men in the drunk condition were more aggressive than men in the placebo condition, and a statistically significant main effect for body weight. Heavy men were more aggressive than light men. Remember, a main effect equals an overall effect. Calling something the main effect doesn't mean it's the most important effect. it means that it's an overall effect of one independent variable at a time. When you have a factorial design with two independent variables, there will be one interaction effect to look for. This is the interaction between the two independent variables. Let's look at how we might go about identifying an interaction effect simply by looking at the results in a table. The table on the top shows how to compute the interaction for the alcohol and aggression study. Remember that an interaction measures differences in differences. You begin by computing two differences. Start with one level of independent variable 1, alcohol photos. The difference between the aggressive and neutral conditions for the alcohol photos is 551 minus 562, or negative 11. Then move to the second level of independent variable 1, plant photos. The difference between aggressive and neutral words for plant photos is 559 minus 552, or 7. Make sure to go the same direction both times. Aggressive minus neutral. There are two differences, negative 11 and 7. This difference of 18 total points is in fact statistically significant, and you can conclude that there's an interaction between word type and photo type. The bottom table shows the data from the cell phone and driving study. While the top example focused on row differences, this example examines column differences. The number 174 is not statistically larger than 132, so there is no interaction between cell phone condition and driver age. Remember, you will still need to perform a significance test to know for sure if the two numbers you get are statistically different from one another or not. It's much easier to detect interactions from a graph than computing them from a table. If the results are plotted in a line graph, as in the top two graphs, you look to see if the lines are parallel. In the graph on the top left, the lines are not parallel, so there is in fact an interaction between word type and photo type. In the graph on the top right, the lines are close to parallel, so there probably is no interaction between age and cell phone condition. In both cases, you would need to perform a significance test to find out for sure. Interactions can also be detected from bar graphs. In the bottom two bar graphs, imagine connecting the tops of the two pink bars and the tops of the two orange bars with straight lines. Would the lines be parallel or not? If the lines are parallel, then there's no interaction between your independent variables. If the lines are not parallel, then there's an interaction between your independent variables. So we can see here that there is in fact an interaction between photo type and word type in the left-hand bar graph, but that there is no interaction in the right-hand bar graph. When describing an interaction in words, you should start with one level of independent variable 1 and explain what is happening with independent variable 2 at that level. Then move to the next level of independent variable 1 and do the same thing. This approach is depicted in the graph and description on the left. Here, you might say something like, child chess experts can remember more chess pieces than digits, but adult chess novices can remember more digits than chess pieces. Another approach is to use such phrases as equally for and depends on, as in depicted on the right, which states the drunk group was more aggressive than the placebo group, especially for heavy men. It's important to note that when a study shows both a main effect and an interaction, the interaction is almost always more important, and that there may be real differences in marginal means, but the more exciting part is the interaction. For example, DeWall's study on alcohol, aggression, and body weight found a main effect for body weight and for alcohol intake, and a significant interaction between body weight and alcohol intake. But the main effect for alcohol intake actually hides the fact that there's an interaction. However, the interaction finding is actually the more interesting part of the overall results. This slide is a reference for the range of possible outcomes you can get from a single 2x2 factorial design. This first slide here presents the first 4 possible outcomes you could achieve in this type of design. And again, this continues the possible outcomes from a single 2x2 factorial design. These are the second 4 options you could possibly achieve as outcomes when performing this type of study. So we can see that there are a total of 8 possible outcomes when performing such a 2x2 factorial design study. These 2 slides are a good reference for you to go over to look and understand how we can come up with different possible outcome patterns when using 2 independent variables, each with 2 levels. So let's wrap up the first section of this chapter. We began by reviewing experiments that simply use 1 independent variable. These simply look at the main effect of that variable on the outcome, or dependent variable. We then began our discussion on experiments that have more than 1 independent variable. Here, we discussed that such experiments look at the main effects of each of the independent variables separately, as well as observe interaction effects between the 2 independent variables. We discussed how to recognize effects in table and graphical form. Finally, I presented a list of the 8 possible outcomes you could get when performing a 2x2 factorial design, or a study that has 2 independent variables, each with 2 levels to them.